The deed was crisp, the ink still fresh. 50 acres of open range for a price that wouldn't even buy a mule anywhere else in the territory. To any man, it was the deal of a lifetime. But the moment Elias Carter set foot on that parched stretch of earth, the wind seemed to die, and the silence pressed in like a warning. From the ridge, he could see the old homestead, a skeletal frame against the blood-red horizon. The front door swayed on rusted hinges, whispering secrets to no one. And down in the low grass, vultures circled slow and patient, as if they'd been waiting for him all along. Men in town had refused to meet his eyes when he mentioned the property. One finally muttered, "Some land's cheap for a reason." Elias had laughed then, but standing here now, he wasn't laughing, because the land was watching him, and it didn't feel empty. If you're ready for a tale of grit, greed, and the kind of danger that rides in with the dusk, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with a fellow Wild West fan. It helps us keep these stories riding strong. Now, saddle up. This one's going to take you somewhere most men never come back from. Elias Carter had never been a man to believe in curses. He'd seen too much of life's ugliness explained by greed, steel, and bad judgment to waste thought on ghost stories. Still, when the land agent slid that deed across the scarred desk and named a price so low it sounded like a punchline, something in Elias's gut had twitched. 50 acres of open range, fenced once upon a time, with a well and a house already built. In a territory where men fought over dry creek beds, it was the kind of deal you didn't argue with. You just signed, shook hands, and tried not to grin too wide. The ride out took most of a day. The trail wound past the outskirts of the small frontier town, across a stretch of sage and sand where the wind carried the smell of dust and old rain. Elias's horse, a bay gelding steady as a church pew, never spooked at jackrabbits or sudden noises. But as they reached the ridge and the land spread out below, the animal's ears flicked back, and he slowed without being told. Elias followed the horse's gaze to the lonely figure of the house. From up here it looked sound enough, good timber, stone chimney, but the windows were black as empty eyes. The final mile felt longer than the rest of the journey combined. A rusted gate leaned drunkenly on one hinge, the name Carter freshly painted over an older, faded scrawl he couldn't quite make out. The fence line wavered in broken angles, posts rotted through or scored deep with marks Elias didn't recognize. He'd been around enough predators to know claw marks when he saw them, but these were too high, too wide. The grass grew patchy, alternating between knee-high green and barren patches where the dirt looked scorched. No recent fire, though, no ash, just dead ground. When he reached the porch, the air changed. The steady prairie wind fell away, leaving a stillness so complete that his own breathing sounded loud in his ears. The front door hung ajar, moving just enough to let out a slow, rhythmic creak. It was the kind of sound that made you feel watched. Elias swung down from the saddle, boots crunching on broken glass half buried in the dust. He kept his rifle loose in his hand, not raised, not threatening, but ready. In the West, readiness was its own language. The first step onto the porch told him the boards were sound. The second told him something bad had happened here. There were stains in the wood, darkened with age, some seeping into the grain in shapes that spoke of struggle. Elias had seen blood before, enough to recognize the way it dried when left too long under the sun. He pushed the door open. Inside, the air was stale, tinged with the faint metallic bite of rust and something sweeter that turned his stomach. Furniture lay overturned as if someone had left in a hurry, or been forced. Dust lay thick on everything, but the walls had been scrubbed in places, not well enough to hide the story. He walked through the room slowly, boots whispering over the worn floor. The kitchen still had plates stacked on a shelf, their edges chipped. A single chair sat upright at the table, as if waiting for someone who never returned. In the back bedroom, the window had been shattered inward. Bits of glass glittered in the dust, and in the center of the floor lay a single boot, child-sized, worn down at the heel. Elias stood there longer than he meant to, listening for a sound he couldn't name. The silence pressed back at him like a weight. Outside again, he led the horse around to the back of the property. The well stood capped and locked with a rusted chain, though the deed had said nothing about that. Beside it, the remnants of a small corral leaned into the wind. Something about the fence posts here was worse. Splinters twisted outward, not inward, as if something had forced its way out. Elias's horse snorted and shifted, glancing toward the tree line where the shadows pooled darker than they should in late afternoon. For the first time in a long while, Elias felt the hair on his neck stir. He told himself it was just the strangeness of an abandoned place. Men made up stories to explain what they didn't understand, and those stories lingered in the bones of a house like a smell you couldn't wash out. But as he made his way back to the porch, something caught his eye, half buried in the dirt by the steps. A glint of metal. He bent down, brushing soil away until he turned up a button, heavy and weathered, the kind used on cavalry uniforms. The eagle was still visible under the tarnish. Strange place for a soldier's button. Stranger still to find it here, on land that no man seemed willing to claim. Elias pocketed it without thinking. He'd come west for a fresh start, and he'd staked what little he had left on this land. Walking away wasn't an option. But the deal that had seemed like salvation in the land agent's office now felt like a bargain struck in the dark. The kind where you don't know the cost until you've already paid. Somewhere out beyond the still trees and silent fields, a lone crow called once, sharp and sudden. Elias looked toward the sound, but saw nothing move, only the empty land, waiting. By sundown, he had unsaddled the gelding and carried his gear inside. He struck a small fire in the hearth, the crackle of burning wood breaking the quiet. But even as the flames took hold, his eyes kept straying to the door, to the windows, to the darkness beyond. Cheap land was never truly cheap out here, and Elias Carter was beginning to suspect the real price hadn't yet been named. The morning after his first night on the property, Elias rode into town with a list in his head. Nails for the fence, hinges for the gate, maybe a sack of grain if the general store had any worth buying. But somewhere beneath those practical thoughts sat the weight of the button in his pocket. He hadn't told himself it mattered. Not yet. But it hadn't left his mind either. The town was little more than a main street, a line of sun-bleached buildings leaning into each other against the wind. Elias tied his gelding outside the general store and stepped inside. The air smelled of flour dust and oil lamps. Behind the counter, a narrow man with a thin mustache was tallying accounts. Elias asked about hinges, but the shopkeeper's eyes slid past him as if something more interesting was happening in the empty street behind. It was the same at the blacksmith's. Elias brought in a cracked stirrup for repair, but the smith, a barrel-chested man with arms like tree trunks, only grunted and kept his hammer swinging. Elias tried to ask about local grazing conditions, harmless talk, yet the man didn't bite, didn't even look up. When Elias mentioned which property he'd bought, the hammer missed its mark and clanged against the anvil. The blacksmith muttered something about the weather and turned his back. By the time Elias reached the saloon, the pattern was too clear to ignore. The piano stopped mid-note as he stepped in. Cards paused in mid-air. A couple of cowhands at the far table exchanged glances and made a quiet exit. Elias ordered a coffee. The whiskey here was better left untouched unless you had a death wish, and leaned against the counter. The barkeep, an older fellow with a jaw like a shovel blade, poured the coffee but kept his mouth shut. Elias let the silence stretch until it felt like rope tightening around the room. "You all go deaf in here," he said finally, "or just when a man mentions the Thornfield tract." That got him a glance. Sharp, quick, then gone. The barkeep wiped the counter slow, the rag tracing the same spot again and again. "Some land's better left alone," he said, not looking up. "Cheaper that way." "I don't believe in cursed ground," Elias said. "Only men who've got a reason to keep others off it." He saw a flicker in the barkeep's eyes, but the man only shrugged. "Believe what you want. Just remember, graves don't care about your beliefs." Then he moved down the counter, conversation over. Elias took his coffee to a table by the window and watched the street. Men came and went, but none looked his way. Even the ones he knew had seen him before in town acted like he wasn't there. It was more than avoidance. It was protection. But whether they were protecting themselves from him or him from something else, he couldn't yet tell. Near noon, an old ranch hand limped into the saloon, his coat dusty from the trail. He paused when he spotted Elias, then made his way over without being invited. "You the fool bought Thornfield?" he asked, lowering himself into the chair opposite. His eyes were pale and restless, scanning the room. "Elias Carter," he said, extending a hand. The old man didn't take it. "Name's Clayton. I worked that land once, long before the last owners." He leaned in. "If you've got sense, you'll ride out before sundown and never look back." Elias sipped his coffee. "Why?" The question was simple, but it hung in the air like smoke. Clayton's jaw worked, but whatever words he wanted to say never made it out. Instead, he stood abruptly, tossed a coin on the table, and muttered, "Because the land remembers." Then he was gone, the swing doors clattering in his wake. Elias sat there a while longer, the coffee cooling in front of him, the words echoing in his head. By the time he stepped back onto the boardwalk, the sun was dipping toward late afternoon. The street was quieter now, shadows stretching long. Elias untied his horse, the weight of the button in his pocket heavier than ever. He'd come to town for hinges and nails. But what he'd bought instead was a dozen unanswered questions, and the sharp, undeniable feeling that the bargain he'd struck was already drawing him into a story no one wanted to tell. By the time Elias returned from town, the sun was already leaning low, painting the horizon in long strokes of red and gold. The land seemed to drink in the color, as if the soil itself had been waiting for it. He unpacked his supplies, the few he'd managed to buy without inviting more stares, and set them just inside the door. The silence was already waiting for him, thick and unmoving. He moved through the house methodically, checking each room again, this time with a lamp in hand. The walls still bore those scrubbed, stubborn stains. In the bedroom, that child's boot sat exactly where he'd left it, though he couldn't shake the feeling that it had shifted slightly, just enough to make him doubt his own memory. He placed it on the dresser, out of sight, and told himself it was nothing. The gelding was restless in the corral, pacing from one broken fence post to the next. Elias topped off the water trough, but the animal barely touched it, ears twitching toward the tree line. He followed the horse's gaze. Nothing moved in the shadows, yet the hair along his forearms prickled. In the West, you learned to trust a horse's instincts over your own. After dark, the wind came back, low and steady, sliding through the gaps in the siding and carrying the smell of the plains. Elias sat at the kitchen table, eating jerky and bread, the lamp throwing long shadows against the walls. He'd grown up in rooms quieter than this, but something about this silence felt occupied, not empty, occupied. Halfway through the night, he heard it. Faint, far off at first, the slow, deliberate creak of wood under weight. He froze, listening. It came again, closer this time, from the direction of the porch. Elias moved without hurry, taking the rifle from its place near the door. He didn't aim it, not yet. He just waited. The creak stopped. Then came another sound, the dry rattle of something brushing along the siding, like fingertips dragging slow. Elias's mind ran through every explanation, wind-blown branch, loose shutter, but none fit the measured pace of it. He stepped to the window and looked out, but the lamplight only showed him his own reflection, staring back with narrowed eyes. When he opened the door, the porch was empty. The night air was cold, the stars clear. He stepped out, scanning the yard. No movement. No sound now but the wind in the grass. But as he turned back toward the house, he saw them. Fresh impressions in the dust of the porch, too wide to be boot prints, too defined to be the marks of any animal he knew. He spent the next hour circling the property, rifle in hand, but found nothing more. Still, when he came back inside, the air in the house felt heavier, as if whatever had been out there had left something behind. He banked the fire, set the rifle beside his bed, and lay down fully dressed. Sleep came slow, chased by the echo of that slow, deliberate creak. Just before dawn, he woke to the sound of the gelding snorting hard in the corral. By the time Elias got outside, the animal was calm again, but something in its eyes told him it had seen more than he had. Elias stood there in the gray light, looking out over the land. Somewhere out there in the stillness was the answer to every strange thing he'd felt since signing that deed, and he had the uneasy sense that the land was waiting for him to find it, whether he wanted to or not. Elias was fixing the corral fence when he first heard the riders. Hoofbeats carry differently across open ground, slow and steady when a man's in no rush, sharp and urgent when trouble's coming. These were neither. They were measured, deliberate, the pace of men who wanted to be heard before they were seen. He leaned on the fence post, watching the dust plume rise from the far ridge. 4 riders crested the hill in a tight line. The lead wore a black coat despite the heat, his hat pulled low, the brim shadowing a face Elias already recognized from whispered talk in town: Rufus Callahan. Behind him, 3 men rode with the same easy posture of men who'd drawn guns before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. None of them looked around much. Their eyes stayed on him. They stopped 20 yards out, close enough for conversation, but far enough to pull iron without warning. Callahan raised one gloved hand in a gesture that was half greeting, half command. "You picked yourself a fine piece of ground," he called, voice carrying clear over the wind. "Most men around here would have thought twice." Elias didn't move from the fence. "Most men didn't pay good money for it." His tone was calm, but his eyes didn't leave the other man's. "I intend to make it worth the price." Callahan's smile didn't touch his eyes. "Price? Friend, you bought yourself a graveyard. Smart man would turn around, ride back to that land agent, and ask for his coin back while he's still breathing." "What happened here?" Elias asked. "Agent said the last owners moved on. This place says otherwise." His words hung in the air like the smell before a storm. The 3 riders shifted in their saddles, hands brushing close to their gun belts. Callahan's answer came slow, measured. "Some stories are better left in the dirt. Last family here. Let's just say they didn't leave of their own accord. And they weren't the first." He let that sink in, watching for Elias's reaction. "You keep poking at this land's history, you'll end up part of it." Elias pushed away from the fence and walked a step closer, close enough now to see the fine leather of Callahan's gloves, the faint dust on his boots. "You here to tell me a story, or to make me an offer?" Callahan's eyes narrowed. "I'll take the land off your hands for what you paid. Cash. You ride away, and you never hear another word about it. You stay." His gaze flicked briefly toward the men behind him. "Then you'll find out the hard way why no man keeps this property." Elias let the silence stretch. Then he shook his head once. "It's mine now, legal and proper. If there's a problem, I'll face it." The false smile drained from Callahan's face like water from a cracked barrel. His voice was flat when he said, "Then you've made your choice, Carter. And choices out here tend to get a man buried." They wheeled their horses and rode off in a slow, deliberate line, leaving only dust and the faint echo of hoofbeats. Elias stood there long after they were gone, the weight of the cavalry button in his pocket somehow heavier than before. The day after Callahan's visit, Elias set out to walk every acre of his land. If the place carried secrets, he meant to see them for himself. The sun was high and sharp, the kind that baked the earth into plates of cracked clay. He carried his rifle slung over one shoulder, more for the comfort of its weight than for any real expectation of trouble, though trouble was already in the air. He started near the house where the soil was darker, richer. The old garden plots had long gone wild, but under the tangle of weeds the ground felt uneven. Elias knelt, brushing away dirt until the curve of rusted iron appeared. A broken hoe lay there, snapped clean in two. Strange thing for a farmer to leave behind, unless he hadn't had time to take it. A few yards further, near the collapsed shed, he found more. Spent cartridge casings half buried in the dust, their brass dulled by weather. He turned one over in his palm and saw the faint military stamp. He thought again of the button in his pocket. One piece by itself meant nothing. Two pieces started to look like a pattern. Following the fence line, Elias found scraps of blue cloth caught on the splintered tops of posts. He tugged one free. Heavy weave like uniform wool, the edges frayed but not rotted through. Whatever had happened here hadn't happened a lifetime ago. The cloth still carried the faint, sour smell of sweat baked into fabric. Toward the north edge of the property, he came across a patch where the ground was softer, the grass thin and colorless. It was the kind of place a man might dig if he didn't want something found. The soil gave under his boot heel. Elias crouched, pressing his hand against it. The shape beneath wasn't stone, too flat, too smooth. A board, maybe, covering something below. He didn't dig right then. Some part of him said not to. Instead, he marked the spot with a broken fence rail and kept moving. The land told its stories in fragments, casings here, cloth there, a scar in the earth that didn't match the rest of the lay. The more he walked, the more it felt like those fragments were circling a single truth. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up, chasing thin clouds across the sky. Elias made his way back to the house, but his eyes kept drifting toward that marked patch in the north field. It felt like an open question, one that could be answered with a few minutes' work and a shovel. But questions had a way of changing a man once he knew the answers. Inside, he laid the casings, the cloth, and the button out on the kitchen table. The lamplight picked out the dull shine of brass and the frayed edges of wool. It looked like evidence. Not to a court, maybe, but to anyone who'd been in uniform, anyone who knew what it meant for army gear to turn up in the wrong place. Elias poured himself a cup of coffee and stared at the pieces. If Callahan was telling the truth, these were just the leftovers of a fight long past, something best forgotten. But if Callahan was lying, and Elias felt it in his bones that he was, then the ground outside wasn't just cursed by stories, it was cursed by blood. He leaned back in his chair, the last light of day sliding through the window. Somewhere out beyond the fence line, the wind carried a sound, not the cry of an animal, not quite the voice of a man, but something between. Elias didn't move. He just listened, letting the sound fade into the night, knowing it wasn't the land that was haunted. It was what had been done to it. The night came on with a heavy sky, clouds blotting out the stars until the land lay under a dull, lidless dark. Elias sat by the hearth, the casings, button, and scrap of cloth still spread across the table, like pieces in a puzzle no one wanted solved. The wind had dropped, leaving a silence so thick he could hear the tick of cooling metal in the stove. It started as a vibration more than a sound, the faint tremor of hooves on hard ground, too many to be a lone traveler. Elias stood slowly, stepping to the window. In the distance, pinpricks of orange light moved in a slow arc, torches bobbing with the rhythm of horses. 6, maybe 7 riders, spreading wide as they approached. He doused the lamp without a second thought. The room fell into blackness, the only light now the glow of the fire. He banked it down until it was barely a smolder, then crossed to the rifle leaning by the wall. Outside, the hoofbeats grew louder, the torchlight flickering across the yard in restless shapes. They stopped short of the porch, holding in a loose semicircle. A voice rose from the dark, carrying the weight of command. "Carter, we know you're in there. Step out with your hands where we can see 'em, and this stays civil." Elias recognized the tone, not lawmen, but soldiers once. The precision in their movements wasn't the kind you learned driving cattle. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved to the side window and peeked out. The men were armed, their mounts steady despite the dark, faces shadowed by wide brims, coats hanging heavy. One of them shifted in the saddle, and Elias caught the glint of brass on his coat, a button like the one in his pocket. "You got no business here," the voice called again. "This land belongs to another. You walk away tonight, you keep breathing." Elias raised the window just enough to be heard. "If the man you work for wants it, he can ask me himself. Until then, I'm staying put." The answer came in the form of a torch, sailing through the front window, glass shattering as it landed on the warped floorboards. Flames leapt instantly, feeding on dry wood and dust. Smoke curled upward, stinging his eyes. They weren't here to talk anymore. They were here to burn him out. Elias kicked the torch back through the broken frame, but another followed almost immediately, landing in the kitchen. He knew he couldn't hold the house if they meant to set it alight from every side. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the memory of that uneven patch of ground in the north field stirred, a reminder that this land was already a grave for someone else. He wasn't eager to join them. He slipped out the back door into the dark, keeping low, rifle in hand. The riders hadn't spotted him yet. Their focus was on the blaze in the front. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of burning wood and the sharp tang of oil. Elias kept moving, every step taking him further from the firelight, and closer to whatever he'd need to do to survive the night. Elias slipped through the shadows behind the barn, the firelight from the house throwing jagged shapes against the ground. He kept low, rifle ready, moving toward the hay storage where he knew there'd be cover. The riders were tightening their circle, their torches cutting arcs in the dark. Somewhere in the quiet spaces between hoofbeats, he heard the distinct sound of boots on wooden planks, someone on foot inside the barn. He edged toward the open doorway, senses narrowed to sound and shadow. A figure emerged from the gloom inside, tall, broad, and wearing a coat that hung heavy with the weight of brass buttons. The man stepped into the torchlight, and the truth struck Elias at once. This wasn't a hired gun from the saloon, and it sure wasn't a ranch hand. It was a cavalry sergeant's coat, worn and frayed at the edges, but still carrying the stripes. The stranger stopped a few paces from Elias, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "Name's Sergeant Webb," he said, his voice flat, as if names were just another formality. "I've been sent to tidy up the problem you've been making for a certain gentleman." His eyes were cold and pale, the kind that never looked away once they'd fixed on you. Elias didn't lower his rifle. "That gentleman wouldn't be Rufus Callahan, would it?" Webb's mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so humorless. "You catch on quick. Quicker than most who've stood where you're standing. They usually don't get the chance to ask questions." "You the one who killed the last family lived here?" Elias asked. The words felt heavy in the space between them. Webb tilted his head as if weighing the value of an honest answer. "I'm the one who made sure Callahan got the land he wanted without complications. That's all you need to know." "That's more than enough," Elias said, stepping closer. "Military gear, military casings, and a sergeant who decided silver was worth more than his oath." Webb chuckled, low and mean. "You think this is about your 50 acres? There's enough silver under this ground to make a man rich enough to buy a governor. Callahan's just the one smart enough to take it." The torches outside shifted, their light sweeping into the barn. Elias could hear Webb's men moving closer, their boots scuffing the dirt floor. Webb's hand never left his pistol. "You could walk away, Carter. Leave tonight. Never look back. Or you could end up the same as the Hendersons. I'll give you 10 seconds to decide." Elias thought of the graves in the north field, the cloth and brass scattered in the dirt, the way the town wouldn't even speak the land's name. He knew what walking away would mean, not just for him, but for anyone else who came after. "I've already decided," he said. His grip on the rifle tightened, the shadows closing in around them. Webb's pale eyes narrowed. "Then you've chosen the harder road." He stepped forward, and the barn seemed to shrink around them. Outside, the torchlight danced higher as the fire at the house caught the roof beams, the smoke curling into the night like a warning. Inside, Elias and the man in the uniform stood one breath away from the first move, the kind that would decide whether either of them walked out alive. The standoff broke when a shout rang from outside, one of Webb's men calling for him. Webb didn't turn his head, but Elias saw the faint irritation flicker across his face. "Hold your position," Webb barked, his voice cutting through the noise of the fire. Then to Elias, "You've got no idea what you're standing on, Carter, no idea at all." "Enlighten me," Elias said, not moving. Webb's smile returned, colder this time. "Silver, thick as river silt, running deep under this whole tract. Callahan's been buying up every acre that touches it. Needs clean title before he brings in a mining crew, and that means anyone squatting on it has to go, one way or another." Elias let the words settle. The casings, the cloth, the button, they all snapped into place. The men who died here hadn't been victims of chance or bad luck. They'd been erased, their lives a cost of doing business, and now Webb was here to balance the ledger again. "You've killed for this before," Elias said. It wasn't a question. Webb shrugged like a man discussing the weather. "I've done what I was paid to do. Callahan understands the value of work well done. The Army never paid enough for the things they asked us to do. Out here, a man gets what he's worth." The firelight outside swelled as the roof of the house collapsed with a crack like a rifle shot. Webb's men shifted in the doorway, their attention split between the blaze and their commander. Webb didn't flinch. "You could have been smart," he said. "Take the cash, leave the problem behind, but you had to dig." Elias's eyes stayed locked on Webb's. "You're wrong about one thing," he said. "This isn't my problem, it's yours." Webb's gaze sharpened, but before he could reply, another noise cut through the crackle of fire. A distant thunder of hooves, faster, heavier than the small group outside. The riders came out of the dark like a wave, their uniforms catching the torchlight. Real cavalry this time, not deserters in stolen coats. Webb's head snapped toward the sound, his calm breaking for the first time. "Positions!" he barked, but his men were already scattering, caught between fighting and fleeing. Elias stepped back, rifle ready. "Looks like the ground's shifting under you, Sergeant." Webb's eyes came back to him, colder than before. "This isn't over." He backed toward the doorway, covering his retreat as the first shots cracked in the yard. Outside, chaos bloomed, gunfire, shouts, the scream of a wounded horse. Elias moved to the barn wall, peering through the gaps in the boards. The cavalry patrol had the deserters pinned, their rifles flashing in the dark. Webb was gone from sight, swallowed in the fight. But Elias knew the man wasn't finished. Men like Webb didn't leave Silver, or witnesses, behind. The barn doors burst open, flooding the dim interior with torchlight and the harsh silhouettes of armed cavalrymen. Their officer barked quick orders, moving with the precision of men who drilled for moments like this. Elias lowered his rifle just enough to show he wasn't a threat. "Sergeant Webb's in here somewhere," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew Webb was too slippery to be standing in plain sight. Gunfire still rattled outside, sharp against the night air. Elias stepped into the yard, scanning the chaos. Webb's deserters were falling back, pinned between the barn and the advancing line of soldiers. A few tried to break for the tree line, but cavalry carbines cut them down before they made it 20 yards. The acrid smell of black powder mixed with the lingering smoke from his burning house. Through the haze, He caught sight of Webb, moving low, quick, slipping toward the north field where the darkness pooled deepest. Elias didn't hesitate. He broke into a run, skirting the edge of the fight, boots pounding the hard ground. Webb looked back once, saw him coming, and veered toward the uneven patch of earth Elias had marked days before. By the time Elias closed the distance, Webb had drawn his pistol. "You should have walked away," Webb snarled, the torchlight catching the brass buttons on his coat. "Now you get buried where you've been poking." Elias leveled his rifle, but Webb was already sidestepping, trying to draw him into the open. A shot cracked, the bullet hissing past Elias's shoulder. He dropped to one knee, firing back. Webb stumbled but kept moving, the two men circling each other in the dark, their breaths loud in the still air between gunfire bursts from the yard. Elias could feel the weight of every life Webb had taken pressing into this moment. They clashed near the half-dug patch, Webb lunging in close, the pistol swinging like a club. Elias caught the blow on his rifle stock, the wood shuddering in his hands. They grappled, boots digging into the soft earth, each man straining for control. Somewhere in the struggle, Elias wrenched the pistol free and sent it skidding into the dark. Webb broke away, but Elias was faster. He slammed the rifle butt into Webb's ribs, sending the man staggering back over the disturbed ground. Webb went down hard, his breath driven out in a sharp grunt. Elias stepped forward, the barrel of his rifle steady, eyes locked on the man who'd turned this land into a graveyard. "You're finished," Elias said, his voice low. "Callahan's done too." Webb laughed through gritted teeth, the sound bitter. "You think taking me in changes what men like him do? There's always another Callahan. Always another Webb." The cavalry officer arrived then, flanked by two soldiers. "Sergeant Webb," he barked, "you're under arrest for desertion, murder, and conspiracy." Webb didn't fight as they hauled him up, but his eyes stayed on Elias, cold and certain. "This isn't the end," he said before they dragged him back toward the light. Elias watched him go, knowing the land's dead would rest easier, but also knowing the man was right. Some fights didn't end with a single night. 3 weeks later, the wind across the Thornfield tract felt different. The smoke was gone, the ash scattered, and in its place stood the slow work of rebuilding. Elias leaned against the porch rail of his newly raised house, watching surveyors drive stakes into the earth. The land was still quiet, but it no longer felt like it was holding its breath. Lieutenant Morrison, the cavalry officer who'd taken Webb into custody, rode up the lane with a packet of papers in his hand. "Governor's signature came through," he said, passing them over. "Callahan's in custody. His confession ties him to every death on this land, and a good many more. The courts will have their say." Elias nodded, the weight in his chest loosening for the first time since the day he'd signed the deed. "What about the families?" he asked. Morrison's expression softened. "The government agreed to your proposal. Callahan's holdings will be sold off and the proceeds split among the surviving kin. It won't bring anyone back, but it's something." Elias's gaze drifted toward the north field, where fresh markers now stood over ground that had once been hidden. "It's more than something," he said quietly. "It's a start." The silver beneath the soil was real, just as Webb had claimed. The surveyors estimated enough to make a man wealthy beyond reason, but wealth had never been the point. He'd struck a deal with a reputable mining outfit, one with the kind of reach Callahan could only imitate. Half the profits would go into a fund for the victims' families. The other half would secure his own future and the land's. "You plan to stay on?" Morrison asked. Elias glanced toward the fence line where the grass bent and swayed in the breeze. "This land's mine now, and it's going to stay that way." By late afternoon, the miners' wagons began arriving, heavy with tools and supplies. Elias stood by as they unloaded, the steady rhythm of work replacing the memory of hoofbeats in the night. He'd expected the place to feel smaller once the danger passed, but if anything, it felt larger, like the boundaries had stretched to fit the weight of what had happened here. That evening he walked the property alone, past the barn, past the corral, past the well that now ran clear after a week's work. At the edge of the north field he stopped. The markers stood straight in the fading light, casting long shadows. "It's over now," he told the ground, not expecting an answer. The wind moved through the grass like a slow exhale. Back at the house, the lamplight glowed in the windows. For the first time, Elias noticed it didn't look hollow anymore. The boards were fresh, the glass unbroken, the door straight on its hinges. A man could live here now, without feeling the land was waiting to swallow him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elias sat on the porch, the deed resting on the table beside him. The paper was worth more than silver or gold now. It was proof that a man could stand his ground against greed, violence, and the ghosts of the past, and still see the day come when the land was his in truth. Some bargains came cheap and some came dear. This one had cost more than he'd ever imagined, but it had been worth every cent.